Hello there, and welcome to Weird Music on the Glumberger channel. Of course, the strange and unusual music show that just takes a different album each and every week and just generates some form of discussion about it. So in today's episode, we are of course returning to our little sort of mini-series on Pride Month we're doing in this month of June of 2026, with another look at another LGBTQ plus aligned artist, or two in this case. This is actually an album I wanted to review for an incredibly long time on this show, but once again, one that I never found time to sit down and absorb my thoughts and feelings about. Until now. This album brings together two stalwarts of the experimental music scene and of the lowercase scene as well. Two artists who have done a tremendous job of both creating music in this very odd experimental scene, as well as creating spaces for the expression of experimental music with their own different labels. This collaborative album is such a distinctly lowercase experience that contains so many minute details across a very lengthy runtime. Very excited to be presenting this one today, so without further ado, I present Undefined, the collaborative album by Richard Chartier and Yann Novak. And so, of course, who is Richard Chartier and who is Yann Novak? Well, we have technically answered this before. If you'd like to know a little bit more about each respective artist, I would recommend you check out our video on Decisive Forms by Richard Chartier and our video on Relocation Reconstruction by Yann Novak. So, yes, of course, today we are looking at the collaborative album Undefined, released in 2013 on Fabio Perletta's 901 editions, as digital download and a physical CD here. And this is, without a doubt, one of my favourite albums from both Chartier and Yann Novak, and one of my favourites within the lowercase genre as well. Nearly 40 minutes of delicate, minute details against growing beds of emerging drones. And so just to have a little bit more context here, it's worth quickly going through the Bandcamp notes. Undefined is the first collaboration between artists Richard Chartier and Yann Novak. For this piece, the artists choose to collaborate in a way that was less about concept and more about the act of listening. The piece began with Chartier creating an unfinished work and sending it to Novak with no explanation, just the instructions to add to it, subtract from it, or a combination in order to finish the piece. Novak was then to send the recording back to Chartier for a simple approval or rejection. Undefined is dedicated to the uncertainties of Los Angeles, where Novak has lived for the past 4 years and Chartier is currently relocating. So yeah, a wholly collaborative album with rather specific yet sort of vague instructions in terms of the approaching the form of composition, essentially. It kind of results in this conceptual piece that has been bounced back and forth between the two, played and edited in subtle ways that completely blur the identities of any occurrence on the album, it feels. Or most of it anyway. A strange, undeniable, monochromatic music experience that drones away for nearly 40 minutes. And within the lowercase scene, this has always been one of my favourite albums I've come across, something that I've wanted to cover on the show for such a long time now, ever since I first heard it and got this physical copy of. It's like there's this surreal, almost intangible quality that makes the work very engaging, and yet it's such a drift into the murmurations of quiet details. Very excited to discuss this one, so let's of course dive in. So unsurprisingly, Undefined starts off incredibly quietly. We have an incredible faint murmuring of these very gentle drones that begin to push down, becoming that kind of wind tunnel aesthetic that feels both very representative of both artists' particular styles. It gently blows the air through this resonating space, sounding delightfully gentle, even as it starts to bring with it a little bit more volume in these growing forms of presence, essentially. And before long, we suddenly get a very faint little melody attempting to form out from the storms of the dust left behind by those lowercase drones, offering us these faint little phrases of electronics that pulsate within that very space itself. it forms or becomes the main character of this scene here. This very gentle little drone that is delightfully low end in places, situated right towards the back as we have the presence of these higher frequencies coming in and out like a gentle siren of some kind. And from there it loops over and over and over, and it becomes an incredibly peculiar composition, one that feels comfortable to hear at these rather quieter volumes, of course, but challenging in its own respects as well. Like, your mind just starts to become untethered by the characteristics of the ever-present drones both artists created here, and as a result, you just seem to drift in and out of this very liminal space that the music is creating. I think, oddly enough, it's actually a rather charming composition. It's one that reveals more hidden details in amongst the composition as it all progresses. These small little lowercase mumblings, all forming these very unusual textures that feel so minute and grainy. And it's almost as though we're reaching inside the very inner mechanisms of electronics, feeling the texture of the atoms as though they were tiny bits of sand perhaps. And it makes it also hypnotizing as a result, though, so much of it being dominated by this repeated motif of faint electronic drones and oscillating frequencies joined together into this very composition. But there is a few variances from time to time, of course. Like, as well as those very lowercase moments, there is even time for the brief appearance of these different sounding higher frequency drones, all forming these faint little apparitions in amongst the composition. And I find I just start to drift in and out of it all, though, pulled along by the hypnotizing experience of these lowercase rumbles, which feel so oddly full of character, yet somehow so sterile and cold to the touch. What I kind of get is this impression of the briefest semblance of a melody being embedded in amongst the subterfuge of faint electronic drones. Very hard to explain, but it's almost like there's this little ambient drone occurring alongside everything here. But its details just feel so shrouded in these tiny minute little textures that blind us from the full picture here. And it's interesting because it's not even it's a somewhat long composition, just shy of 40 minutes in length. Like, it's not the longest thing, of course, but 40 minutes for a single song is sort of long for most people. And yet, even though it is 40 minutes, it feels like it's still not really enough time to be aware of everything that's actually happening here across that full length, as the image feels intentionally covered by these tiny minimalist details. It's perhaps why I think it's such a neat composition as a result, though. It's the kind of thing I just enjoy from the lowercase genre as a whole. Like, you end up just getting lost within the compositions themselves, pulled along so effortlessly by the faint murmuring details of lowercase, hypnotized and just dragged into these incredibly liminal spaces as a result. And it's something I just enjoy so much about the genre, sitting there and just taking in the multitude of details that are so tiny and minute and so difficult to really focus in upon. Like, you can find yourself just falling into these brief little sections that you swear you've maybe have heard before as the composition moves on and on, or you end up discovering the emergence of other faint little textures that break up that cycle slightly, creating this very odd ebb and pull effect that is present in so many of these little albums we review on this show. I think it's perhaps a testament as to why this particular album is so interesting to experience. The way in which Chartier and Novak have both approached the material, both editing it, sending it back, editing it again, on and on, maybe back and forth and stuff until the very details become this undefined space. Like, even as Undefined, from the name itself, as the whole thing is, it's so full of these wonderful minute textures. Like, I just really delight in all the faint little murmurings of quiet minimal electronics. These tiny little grainy instances of sound just colliding in your hearing against a backdrop of droning elements. And there's even just this constant occurrence of some nice low end across the length of this one as well, like really helping to create this ambient bed that houses so many little noises essentially. Like, the way you'll find yourself just pulled in and out of it all, that ebb and pull once again, finding these wonderful brief little moments where this occurrence just drifts in across the spectrum of your hearing, forming these faint little moments that form so much character within the confines of this composition. And even though, like in most lowercase compositions, there is kind of a threatening presence to some of the frequencies, I still feel like on here it's so incredibly pleasant to listen to, of course, with it being a delightful listening experience from start to end. Like, certain composers within the genre do like to play around with higher end of frequencies in arguably harsh ways. It comes up across a lot in lowercase music, and some albums we've looked at before on the show, some albums we should look at on the show as well. And whilst Undefined here certainly does explore that very same notion in its own ways, of course, it feels a lot easier to approach and experience. Like, it's weird because it's certainly an incredibly hypnotizing experience as well. It just really seems to be pulling on the fabric of time and space the more it all just stretches onward across that lengthy runtime. I would say, interestingly enough though, it's probably around 20 minutes into the whole thing that we get what comes across as a bit more of a radical change though. We end up getting this sort of nervous vibration as an oscillating drone just slowly falls into the scene, bringing with it an emphasis on certain lowercase textures, as well as on that low end that just seems to intensify much, much more. It's like watching a change in everything occurring in this sort of macro level that takes time to really transition from point to point. And it becomes a departure from the resting place that the composition was constantly offering as a form of those loops of electronic drones and tones and little frequencies and micro details essentially. And here it presents us something that feels a little bit more cautious and anxious. Like, it's very peculiar because it feels so much more hidden in amongst the composition as well, having taken such a long time to slowly emerge from the bed of textural sounds. But it does create this rather interesting moment that feels a little more emotionally charged, I would argue, as you find yourself set a little bit further forward as it's all occurring, even though it continues to be so ungraspable in its own right. But it's interesting as the process of creating the composition was more about the act of listening for both Chartier and Novak, their only instruction to being to add, remove, or a combination of both essentially. And by, I assume, constantly approaching the composition a number of times back and forth within this manner, we end up getting something that completely blurs the presence of both respective artists, it feels, featuring these faint little murmurations that you could attribute to one artist or the other if you sort of know about the sound palettes of Richard Chartier and Yann Novak, especially if you explored their wider works, essentially. But technically on this, it feels impossible to truly know. Like, who did what? Who knows? And it feels like the eventual goal was to completely eradicate any individual identity within the composition, and instead create and present something that is truly undefined as a result. Is there perhaps a reason why this has just always been one of my favourites within the lowercase genre though? The way it easily represents the joy of collaboration, the joy of playing around with sounds and seeing what happens, and, from simply sending a file back and forth to each other, Chartier and Novak ends up creating something that sounds like this as a result of doing that. And it's so cool how it represents something that is so very much a representation of both artists, but also completely eradicates any individual aspects of them in this really weird, intangible way. Like, it kind of breaks my brain a little bit to think about, but it's something I truly adore about this particular album. Something very neat and cool, and especially if you're a fan of either artist of either Chartier or Novak, this is such a delight to come across if you ever have done or if you have heard it. I think it's just one of the neatest little things, basically. So yes, definitely a very peculiar yet enigmatic composition. Like, there's so many droning elements that really end up dominating the scene at times on this one, despite the insistence of those faint frequency and textural electronics. And even as it slowly transforms across the length of the entire composition, it just feels like it's never forming itself into anything tangible. Like, it always just seems to be slightly out of reach, completely undefined by its textures and characters. And it's perhaps why, as mentioned, I think it's so neat, as it's distinctly minimal as a result. The whole presentation of the album being one that is steeped in ultra minimalism, just to go on a bit about that as well, ultra minimalist in every respect, from the way the whole thing literally sounds, but also to the album's artwork here, like, just white with just their name basically, essentially. And actually two fonts as well, which are featured on the inside of here, Pantone 5507C and Pantone Cool Grey 10C. That are the only two colours you get against the white background here. I think there's something very neat about it though, like the artwork of what little there is, as undefined as the music itself. It's perhaps the kind of album that can't really be represented by anything physical, if that makes any sense. And instead, it's just a sort of being of all these faint little details that you can't make out the whole image of. Like there's something there, but there's also not something there. Somehow. Definitely a balmy statement, but I think it'll make sense to some people, maybe. But yeah, even, as mentioned, within the lowercase genre, just one of my favorites. Like, because I just adore the way this whole thing sounds and presents itself, and the experience it pulls you on across the entire length of it all. Like, you just get this gentle simmering bed of electronics, one that is so quiet and minimal, featuring trademarks of both respective artists, blurred behind a litany of textures. And it's so cool because, although I have no idea what either one has done, they have both contributed in the creation of something I think is really cool to listen to. Like, this is a lovely quiet album that you can just put on, like if you just want to get lost within the micro textures and really appreciate all of those little details that are in there, or one you can just fall asleep to as you just let the whole thing hypnotize you. Like, it's something I love to do. I love listening to lowercase music as I want to fall asleep, because you just end up in this bed of electronic textures and it's so cool to hear. And this is a lovely one to do so as well at times. But yes, it just amazed me because I just adore the work of Yann Novak and Richard Chartier, and hearing it in a collaborative setting, it results in something that I think is one of the coolest things within the whole genre. An incredibly intangible composition, but it's one that just becomes a fascinating 40-minute excursion of lowercase murmurings and rumbles. A delightful presentation of lowercase notions that transports us into the inner workings and macro details of machinery and circuitry, it feels, blurred completely to time and place itself. It's something I have always enjoyed hearing, and something I'm really glad to have finally presented on this show, essentially. Like, as mentioned, one I have wanted to review since I actually bought this CD, which goes back a couple of years now, like a fair few years. But it's only that I found the drive to finally sit down and write about it, though, which I'm glad to have done. Like, it's often the way with a lot of reviews on this show. Like, there's so much stuff I want to review, and eventually I do get around to it. But man, I know the wheel has a lot of things on there that we need to cover, but the actual internal list is immense. But we got there, and that's the main thing. And I'm so glad to have finally talked about this one here. But I think with that, we will come to the end of our episode of Weird Music today. Another episode for Pride Month covering two of my absolute favourite artists. Like, I'm such a fan of Chartier and Novak's output, and seeing it in this collaborative forum is just truly a delight. A peculiar and experimental release that is rather challenging at times, with its dives into higher pitch frequencies here and there, but also a delight in so many other respects as well, like the kind of thing that hides as many different details in amongst the faint speckles of dust, themselves barely visible against a white background here. Truly amazing, and something I'm so glad we have finally discussed on this show. So yes, if you've made it this far, I hope you have enjoyed today's episode of Weird Music. I wish you all the best, take care, and bye bye for now. Bye bye.